Hello and thank you for being here. I'm Professor Pankravitz. The European Union, a collective of European states, is comprised of the diverse ethnic groups speaking various languages. Despite the history of conflicts among its members, the EU has achieved remarkable progress. This challenging and seemingly idealistic task of European states was made possible by fraternity. It's my first time meeting you since I'm new to this conference. I'm delighted to introduce you to fraternity, a philosophical concept that has been practically applied in Europe after World War II and served as the cornerstone of Japanese diplomacy during the Democratic Party of Japan administration from 2009 to 2012. To begin with, let's explore what fraternity truly means. According to the Oxford Dictionary of English, it is defined as friendship and mutual support within a group. Imagine you are at the station waiting for a train. Suddenly, you see a complete stranger slip on the stairs. Without a second thought, you rush over to offer a helping hand. That selfless and altruistic act is the very essence of fraternity. The Austrian philosopher Richard Coudenhove-Kalergi harnessed the spirit of fraternity as a fundamental principle in the endeavor to unite European nations, ultimately paving the way for the establishment of the contemporary European Union. Here is a brief explanation of his life. Coudenhove-Kalergi was born in Tokyo on November 1894 and dedicated his entire life as an advocate for a federation of nations. His father was an Austro-Hungarian nobleman descended from a prominent aristocratic lineage dating back to the Byzantine Empire. This noble heritage enabled him to approach and collaborate with prominent figures on his plan, such as then Austrian Chancellor and the heads of the German Central Bank. However, Hitler explicitly opposed Coudenhove-Kalergi's pan-European movement because it contradicted his belief in German superiority and the legitimacy of the seizing Jewish and Slavic territories. Growing fascist criticism and propaganda targeting his idea compelled him to dissolve movement and flee to the United States. During his stay in the United States until the late 1945, his pan-European aspirations garnered the attention of prominent politicians, including the then President of the United States and the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. These individuals would later play a crucial role in initiating the postwar reconstruction of Europe, which paved the way for the eventual integration. Today, he is widely recognized as the architect of the post-war world order, which earned him a nomination for the Nobel Peace Prize in the 1970s during the formation of the European communities. Beyond policy, his greatest contribution was providing a shared value system to overcome exclusive nationalism, allowing different nations to coexist as brothers. He argued that spiritual integration, a sense of being European citizens, might precede any economic or political union. This visionary approach, emphasizing the fraternity, became the ideological foundation for the formation of the modern European Union. Now, let's dive into the modern European Union and how its approach to integrating Europeans is being realized. A prime example of the Schengen Agreement, which allows citizens to travel, work, and reside across borders without passports. Furthermore, the Erasmus program promotes cultural exchange amongst millions of young people, gradually building a shared European identity from the grassroots level. By prioritizing human connection and mutual support over the nationalism, the EU has transformed Coudenhove-Kalergi's philosophy into a reality. As a reality has already proven, fraternity turned to be not just an abstract concept but the core foundation of the unified Europe. He prioritized brotherhood rather than controversies in order to prevent recurring wars. Looking back at Europe's chaotic and disordered history, it's clear that France was the birthplace of the plenty of groundbreaking theoretical foundations and revolutions. This was because the country was located at the heart of economic and military powerhouses. The 1789 French Revolution, primarily initiated by peasants and progressive middle to small-cap capitalists, overthrew the feudalistic monarchy. Subsequently, the wave of republicanism spread throughout Europe. Although it had been over 2 centuries since the revolution, its fundamental values are still held dear in the minds of European citizens as a member of the free society. These values are inscribed on France's national slogan, liberty, equality, and fraternity. Amongst those principles, Coudenhove-Kalergi highlighted the importance of fraternity on many occasions. Coudenhove-Kalergi believed that the freedom was a foundation of human dignity and an important value. At the same time, however, he recognized that excessive capitalism produced serious social and economic inequalities as a byproduct. In the United States, where freedom took precedence, the gap between rich and poor has continued to widen. In the third quarter of 2025, the wealthiest 1% have about $55 trillion in assets, roughly equal to the total wealth owned by the bottom 90% of Americans combined. In contrast, communism, which swept across the world in the 20th century, sought to counter the inequalities generated by free competition by placing greater emphasis on equality. It could be said that communism is a byproduct of excessive freedom that caused severe inequality. In the Soviet Union, where equality was prioritized, land and property were violently confiscated from landowners and capitalists and turned into collective property under the Раскулачивание campaign. The promotion of theoretically driven and unrealistic collectivization policies led to the man-made famine in early 1930s, and it is estimated that more than 10 million people died. In Ukraine, the famine is widely recognized as the Holodomor and is regarded as a component of the ethnic cleansing orchestrated by the Stalin regime. Therefore, even if two of those principles are both matter and indispensable components of modern society, it is insufficient when they are separated. Coudenhove-Kalergi was well aware of these issues. In his book, The Totalitarian State Against Man, published in 1938, he emphasized the importance of fraternity, saying, quote, "Its aim is collaboration in freedom, toleration, consideration, and humanity. Socialism on the basis of individualism, the coordination of the individual with the community, of freedom with order, of competition with cooperation." Coudenhove-Kalergi argued that the French Revolution for freedom and the Russian Revolution for equality each proved insufficient on their own. Freedom led to inequality, while equality requires coercion and produces totalitarianism. Only through fraternity, which is a spirit of voluntary cooperation based on individualism, can freedom and equality be reconciled in human and harmonious society. Fraternity transcended Europe and spread globally, including Japan. One prominent pre-war statesperson, Ichiro Hatoyama, who would later become Japan's prime minister in the 1950s, was profoundly influenced by its sincere spirit and thoughtful rhetoric. In 1932, he translated Coudenhove-Kalergi's book, The Totalitarian States Against Man, into Japanese and renamed it Freedom and Life. He translated the core idea of fraternity as UI in Japanese. Despite Japan's lack of freedom of speech before 1945 and the government's opposition of numerous individuals, Hatoyama's intense hatred for totalitarianism remained undiminished. He even criticized the Tojo cabinet for its military-led diplomatic decisions and the ineffectiveness of party policies, let alone its alliance with Nazi Germany. His unwavering opposition to totalitarianism and his hope for fraternity ultimately led to his resignation for his position. As prime minister, Hatoyama's diplomacy embodied the very essence of fraternity. He sought to improve Japan's relations with other nations under the fraternal spirit. After World War II, Japan's relations with the USSR were strained and hostile. Undeterred, Hatoyama visited Moscow to meet Khrushchev in person and signed the Soviet-Japanese Joint Declaration of 1956. While this movement faced domestic opposition, it ultimately led Japan to rejoin the United Nations and reintegrate into the international community. Ichiro Hatoyama dedicated his life to fraternity and steadfastly upheld his belief. Fraternity also captured the mind of Yukio Hatoyama, who later became the first prime minister from the Democratic Party of Japan. Yukio Hatoyama was a strong advocate of the fraternity and branded his diplomacy as fraternal diplomacy. He proposed the East Asian Community, which aims to boost international trade in East Asia, particularly with China, South Korea, and ASEAN members. For more than decades, we Japanese have faced a number of severe issues on diplomacy with neighboring countries. East Asia was deeply affected by the World War II and the Cold War, and the lingering impact of the conflict was evident even after the end of the wars. However, the goal was to overcome past rivalries and foster economic cooperation and support amongst those countries. Unfortunately, due to his resignation over issues related to U.S. Air Station Futenma and his declining popularity less than a year after his inauguration, fraternal diplomacy was lost. During the subsequent 2 years of Democratic Party's rule, events such as the collision with the Chinese fishing boats and the dispute over the ownership of Senkaku Island further strained Japanese relationship with China, and the spirits of fraternity failed to materialize in reality. One of the reasons fraternal diplomacy failed was the challenge of bridging the gap between reality and ideals. When the Democratic Party of Japan came to the power in 2009, its campaign promise of fraternal diplomacy centered on strengthening diplomacy in Asia. One of the policies in Asia was the concept of the East Asian Community. However, this concept lacked a clear vision of its actual purpose. This was because the DPJ placed a heavy emphasis on harmony with other countries, leading to compromises with its nations. As a result, statements made by the Japanese government varied depending on the audiences. Despite facing severe disputes with both the United States and China while serving as Prime Minister, Yukio Hatoyama was unable to take decisive action against them. Additionally, China and the United States competed for the influential position in East Asia, each with different interests. Prime Minister Hatsuyama made diplomatic effort to build friendly relations with both China and the United States, but the limited time availability prevented the implementation of those efforts. But the limited time availability prevented the implementation of these efforts. Although the attempts to involve fraternities in Japan proved unsuccessful, are there any future prospects for fraternity, and is their possibility still intact? Currently, the world is facing serious divisions and conflicts, with a growing tendency to avoid or even exclude interactions with people who have different values or ways of thinking. Political parties and forces that advocate for nationalism are gaining strength both inside and outside Japan, while the concepts of fraternity and cooperation are gradually being lost. The pan-Europeanism that Coudenhove-Kalergi aspired to survive opposition from Nazi Germany and other totalitarian powers, and later became a pillar in the creation of the EU after the war. However, I want to make sure that when he passed away in 1972, Europe was still divided between the capitalist and socialist blocs, and the organization like the EU has not yet been born. At the time, only a small customs union amongst a few Western countries was taking shape. The seeds he planted resonated with many people, and through great efforts, they eventually bloomed into today's EU. Society is a man-made machine, and each individual is indispensable. The peaceful unification of Europe was achieved because people who longed for freedom and peace chose to embrace fraternity. Fraternity is a concept that resonates not just in Europe but throughout the world. In Japan, for example, it was demonstrated in efforts such as the restoration of diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union. Whether or not people are consciously aware of fraternity, many of humanity's greatest achievements were built upon compassion for others and respect for differences and individuality. Through learning about fraternity this time, I have realized the importance of acting with convictions and taking responsibility to think things through. Unlike Coudenhove-Kalergi, I am living in a free and peaceful world, but I want to devote myself fully to achieve my own goals, just like him. This is all for today. Thank you for listening to my presentation. Thank you.